It was a crisp autumn evening when Julia found herself alone in her newly rented house for the first time. The house stood at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by tall trees whose skeletal branches scraped against the windows like bony fingers. She loved the isolation, at least that's what she had told herself when she signed the lease. Tonight, however, the silence felt oppressive. Julia had spent the day unpacking and organizing, and by the time night fell, she was too tired to do much else. She settled into the living room, flipping through channels on the TV, the faint hum of static filling the air. It was then she noticed something strange. The back porch light, which she had turned off earlier, was now flickering. Old wiring, she muttered, trying to reassure herself, but something gnawed at her, a whisper in her gut telling her to check it out. Armed with her phone flashlight, she unlocked the sliding door and stepped onto the creaking wooden deck. The cold bit at her skin as she approached the light. It buzzed faintly before dying completely, plunging her into darkness. She quickly spun around, only to see her reflection in the glass door. Except it wasn't her reflection. It was a shadowy figure standing just behind her. Heart pounding, Julia whipped around, but no one was there. She laughed nervously, chalking it up to exhaustion and overactive imagination. She locked the door and drew the curtains tightly before returning to the couch. The TV now played a late-night talk show, but she couldn't focus. Every creak, every whisper of wind made her skin crawl. Around midnight, Julia's phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Why did you close the curtains?" Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the message, her mind racing. Her first thought was to call the police, but what could she say? She didn't hear anything outside, no sign of forced entry. It could be a prank. Shaking, she blocked the number and resolved to ignore it. But then the next text came, this time with a photo of her sitting on the couch, taken from outside the living room window. Julia froze. Her mind screamed at her to move, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Finally, she bolted up, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, and dialed 911. The dispatcher tried to keep her calm as Julia explained the situation. They promised an officer would be there soon, but soon felt like an eternity. She stayed on the line, pacing the living room, her eyes darting to every shadow. Minutes later, she heard the distant wail of a siren. Relief washed over her. But just as she approached the front door to greet the arriving officer, the power went out. Darkness engulfed the house. Julia's breathing quickened as she fumbled for her flashlight. The phone buzzed again. Another message. Too late. She screamed as the door burst open. Not the front door, but the basement door. Heavy, hurried footsteps stormed up the stairs. Julia dashed toward the front door, her knife trembling in her hand. She could see the flashing blue lights outside, hear the officer shouting, but the intruder was closing in. The last thing she saw before collapsing into the officer's arms was a pair of wild, gleaming eyes staring at her from the shadows inside her house. The police found no one. No sign of forced entry. No footprints. No phone with which the photos could have been sent. But they did find one thing in the basement. A small, makeshift bed and wrappers from food that Julia hadn't bought. Someone had been living there, watching her, waiting.
Story number 2.
It started with the smell. Mia had lived alone for years in her small, single-story home on the outskirts of town. She was used to the quiet hum of her evenings, the steady creaks of her old house, and the occasional stray animal rustling in the bushes outside. But this smell, this awful, sickly sweet stench, was new. It clung to the air, growing stronger as night fell. She searched the house that first evening, convinced it was something simple. Maybe something had spoiled in the fridge, or perhaps a rodent had gotten into the walls. But no matter where she looked, the source of the smell eluded her. By the second night, the odor was unbearable, seeping into every corner of her home. Mia found herself gagging, spraying air freshener at her until the can ran dry. She even called a plumber, thinking something might be wrong with the pipes. But the plumber found nothing. Could be something under the house, he suggested with a shrug before leaving. That night, she noticed something else. The smell wasn't the only thing invading her home. There were sounds now, soft, almost imperceptible at first. A faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. It came from the attic. Mia froze in her bed, clutching the sheets tightly. She lived alone. There shouldn't be anyone or anything up there. She grabbed her phone and called her best friend, Hannah. You're probably just freaking yourself out, Hannah said, though her voice carried a tinge of unease. Check it out in the morning. It's probably squirrels or something. Morning couldn't come fast enough, but the scratching stopped long before sunrise. By the third night, Mia was desperate. The smell was suffocating, and the scratching had returned, louder this time. It wasn't just in the attic anymore. She could hear it in the walls, in the crawl space beneath her floorboards. She decided she couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, Mia climbed into the attic. The air up there was thick and heavy, the smell nearly knocking her off her feet. The beam of her flashlight swept across the cramped space, illuminating dusty boxes and cobwebs. But then it caught something. Movement. In the corner, huddled in the shadows, was a figure. Mia's breath hitched as the flashlight illuminated a man, thin, pale, his clothes filthy and torn. His eyes were wild, glinting in the dim light. "Who are you?" she choked out, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he grinned, his teeth yellow and sharp, and then, before she could react, he lunged. Mia screamed and scrambled backward, her flashlight tumbling out of her hand and rolling across the attic floor. She swung the crowbar wildly, her vision swimming in the dark. She heard him laughing, high-pitched and deranged, as he scrambled back into the shadows. She fled the attic, locking the hatch behind her. Heart racing, she called the police. When they arrived, they searched the attic and the entire house, but found nothing. No man, no evidence anyone had been there. The officers assured her it was likely a vagrant who had moved on. But Mia knew better. She couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house set her on edge. She kept every light on, her phone clutched in her hand. Just as she began to drift off, her phone buzzed with a notification. A new photo had been uploaded to her cloud storage. Confused, she opened it. It was a picture of her, taken from the foot of her bed. The man was there, standing in the shadows, his grin wider than before. Mia never slept in that house again.
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be just another quiet evening for Ethan. He had recently moved into his new apartment, a high-rise building on the edge of the city, and was still getting used to the unfamiliar sounds of the place. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional elevator ding, and the faint creak of his neighbor's footsteps above him. Living alone was a welcome change from his previous chaotic roommate situation, and tonight he planned to relax with a movie and some takeout. As the evening wore on, Ethan settled into his couch. The room was dimly lit, the flickering glow of the TV casting long shadows across the walls. He was halfway through his movie when he noticed it, a faint tapping sound. At first, he thought it was coming from the movie. He paused it, and the sound continued, a slow, deliberate tap, 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 as if someone were lightly knocking on glass. It was coming from the sliding glass door to his balcony. Ethan froze. He lived on the 14th floor. There was no way anyone could be out there. Heart pounding, he turned his head toward the door. The curtains were drawn, but he could see the faint outline of a shadow, motionless and tall. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, pretending it wasn't there. But then the tapping grew louder, more insistent. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his hands trembling as he whispered into the receiver. "There's someone on my balcony," he told the dispatcher. "Are you sure?" the woman on the line asked. "Do you have a neighbor who could be playing a prank?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "I'm on the top floor. There's no one above me." The dispatcher assured him that officers were on their way, but Ethan couldn't just sit there. He crept toward the door, his breath shallow, and pulled the curtain aside. The balcony was empty. Ethan blinked, his mind racing. He could have sworn he'd seen a shadow. Was he imagining things? The tapping had stopped, and the night outside seemed calm. He felt a mix of relief and foolishness as he slid the curtain back into place and returned to the couch. Minutes later, there was a knock at his front door. Ethan jumped, nearly dropping his phone. He checked the peephole. 2 police officers stood in the hallway, their uniforms crisp and official. He opened the door, feeling a wave of relief. "We got your call," one of them said. "May we come in?" Ethan nodded and stepped aside. The officers entered, their eyes scanning the room. He explained what had happened, though he felt embarrassed admitting it now. One of the officers stepped onto the balcony to take a look, while the other stayed with Ethan. "Nothing out here," the officer reported after a few minutes. The other officer turned to Ethan. "If you see or hear anything else, don't hesitate to call. It's probably nothing, but better safe than sorry." Ethan thanked them, and they left. He locked the door behind them and double-checked the balcony before returning to the couch. Hours passed, and the apartment grew eerily quiet. Ethan was finally beginning to relax when his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Why didn't you let me in?" His blood ran cold. His hands shook as he stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the message. A moment later, another text came through, this time with a photo. It was taken from inside his apartment. The photo showed Ethan sitting on his couch, staring at his phone, completely unaware of the figure standing in the shadows of the hallway behind him. Ethan didn't have time to scream before the lights went out.
Story number 4.
It was the kind of house no one wanted to live in for long. Nestled at the end of a secluded dirt road, the old Victorian had stood vacant for years before Claire stumbled upon the listing. The rent was suspiciously low, but Claire was desperate to escape her overcrowded apartment. She ignored the unease in her gut when the landlord handed her the keys without much conversation. The first few nights passed uneventfully. The house was drafty, the pipes groaned, and the floors creaked, but Claire chalked it all up to the charm of an old home. On the fourth night, however, something changed. She had just climbed into bed when she heard it. Faint whispers coming from somewhere in the house. At first, she thought it might be the wind whistling through the cracks, but the whispers were too distinct, like voices speaking just out of earshot. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped. Claire convinced herself it was nothing and went to sleep with the lamp on. The next morning, she found something strange. On the kitchen table, there was a single piece of paper she didn't remember leaving out. Scribbled in shaky handwriting were the words, "Do not look." Her stomach churned. She didn't own paper like this. It was yellowed, aged, the kind you'd expect to see in an antique shop. She brushed it off as a prank. Maybe the landlord or a neighbor had a twisted sense of humor. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to drift down the hallway outside her bedroom. Claire bolted the door and turned up the volume on her phone, trying to drown them out. Around 3 a.m., she heard a soft knock at her bedroom door. "Who's there?" she whispered, clutching her blanket tightly. No response. The knock came again, more insistent. She held her breath, willing herself to stay silent. Then the knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of something scraping against the wood, like nails dragging down the surface. The next morning, Claire noticed deep, jagged scratches on the outside of her bedroom door. She decided she'd had enough. She packed her bags, called the landlord, and demanded to end her lease. "Is it the whispers?" he asked calmly, as if he'd heard it all before. Claire's blood ran cold. "You knew about this? Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't think they'd bother you so soon," he said, his voice low. "They usually wait a few weeks." She hung up and drove to a friend's house, vowing never to return. A few days later, Claire realized she had left her laptop behind in the house. She debated leaving it, but eventually decided to go back during daylight. When she arrived, the house was unnervingly still. She rushed to the bedroom, grabbed her laptop, and was about to leave when she noticed something on the floor. A new piece of paper. "You looked." Claire turned to leave, but froze in her tracks. Standing at the end of the hallway was a figure. It was tall and emaciated, its face obscured by long, matted hair. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its head tilted slightly, as if watching her with an intense, unblinking focus. Claire bolted for the door, her heart pounding in her chest. As she flung it open and ran to her car, she heard it. The whispers, louder than ever, echoing in her ears. When she looked in the rearview mirror, the figure was standing in the upstairs window, still watching, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Claire never told anyone what happened in that house, but every so often when she's alone, she hears whispers in the dead of night. And sometimes she wakes up to find yellowed paper with cryptic messages left by her bed.
Story number 5.
The storm came without warning. Nina had just settled into her family's old cabin for a weekend of solitude. It was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest neighbor, and surrounded by towering pines that swayed in the wind like eerie sentinels. The place had always given her an odd feeling, but she loved the escape it offered from the noise of the city. The rain started as a drizzle, tapping lightly on the tin roof. By nightfall, it had turned into a downpour, accompanied by fierce winds and distant rumbles of thunder. Nina curled up by the fireplace, trying to lose herself in a book. That's when she heard it, a faint knock at the front door. She froze, her heart thudding in her chest. No one should be out here. She hadn't told anyone she was coming, and the nearest road was a long hike away. The knock came again, louder this time. "Hello?" Nina called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She crept to the door, peering through the peephole. The distorted view revealed nothing but darkness and rain. She hesitated, then flicked on the porch light. The bulb flickered weakly before going out. Another knock, more insistent now. Taking a deep breath, she cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. There was no one there. Only the storm, howling and relentless. Nina shut the door quickly and locked it. She told herself it was probably just a branch blown against the cabin by the wind. But deep down, she wasn't convinced. An hour later, she heard it again. This time, it wasn't at the front door. It was at the window behind her. A rhythmic, deliberate tap, tap, tap on the glass. Slowly, she turned her head. The window was fogged from the cold, but through the condensation, she could make out the faint outline of a hand pressed against the glass. Her breath caught in her throat. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. The power flickered, then went out entirely, plunging the cabin into darkness. The tapping stopped. For a moment, all she could hear was the pounding rain and her own panicked breathing. Then, from somewhere inside the house, she heard the floorboards creak. Nina's stomach dropped. She was sure she had locked the doors and windows, but now she wasn't so sure. Grabbing the poker from the fireplace, she moved cautiously toward the sound. "Is someone there?" she whispered. Silence. She reached the hallway and flicked her flashlight on. The narrow beam illuminated the wood-paneled walls and the rows of family photos hanging there. But something was wrong. One of the photos had been taken down. In its place was a crude drawing on the wall, etched deep into the wood. It was a stick figure with a circle for a head and long, jagged arms reaching out toward a smaller figure. Beneath it were the words, "I'm inside." Nina stumbled back, her heart racing. She turned to run, but standing at the end of the hallway was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes were wide and hollow, and its mouth hung open as if frozen mid-scream. Nina screamed and bolted for the door, but the figure didn't move. It just watched, its eyes following her every step. She made it outside and ran blindly into the woods, the rain drenching her as she stumbled through the undergrowth. She didn't stop until she reached the dirt road, where a passing car finally picked her up. When she returned with the police the next day, the cabin was empty. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no drawing on the wall. But one thing was different. All the family photos were gone. In their place were new ones, featuring Nina asleep in the cabin, taken from inches away.
Story number 6.
The voice started on a Friday night. Marcus had been excited about the weekend. He planned to relax, maybe play some games and order pizza. Living alone in his small apartment wasn't lonely. It was peaceful, the perfect retreat from his hectic job. It was just past midnight when he first heard it, a faint whisper that seemed to come from the corner of the room. "Marcus." He froze. Every hair on his body standing on end. The whisper was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. He muted the TV and strained to listen, his heart pounding. Silence. "Must be tired," he muttered, trying to convince himself it was nothing. He brushed it off and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next night, the voice returned. "Marcus, I see you." This time, it was louder, clearer. It came from the direction of his closet. Marcus sat up in bed, his chest tightening with fear. He stared at the closed closet door, willing it to stay shut. When he mustered the courage, he grabbed his phone and shone the flashlight toward it. Slowly, he crept out of bed and opened the door. Nothing, just his clothes and a few boxes. But the air inside felt wrong, colder, heavier. Marcus quickly shut the door and climbed back into bed, leaving the lamp on. By Sunday night, he was exhausted, his nerves frayed. The whispering hadn't stopped. If anything, it had grown more persistent. "Marcus, let me in." He tried playing music, turning up the TV, anything to drown it out, but the voice cut through it all, as though it were inside his head. At 3 a.m., Marcus finally snapped. He stood in the middle of his room and yelled, "Who's there? What do you want from me?" The whisper answered immediately. "Look under the bed." A chill ran down his spine. He stared at the edge of the bed, the dark void beneath it feeling deeper than it should. He didn't want to look, but he felt compelled, as though the voice had latched onto his very thoughts. Clutching his phone for light, he dropped to his knees and slowly lowered his head to peek under the bed. The flashlight beam illuminated nothing but dusty floorboards at first. Then he saw it. two gleaming eyes staring back at him, wide and unblinking. Marcus screamed and scrambled back, slamming his head against the bed frame. The eyes vanished, and the whisper turned into laughter. Low, guttural, and wrong. He bolted out of the apartment and spent the night at a friend's house. When he returned the next day with a locksmith to change all the locks, the apartment felt different. The air was stale, and an unnatural silence hung over everything. As Marcus walked into the bedroom, his blood froze. Written on the wall in what looked like ash were the words, "You let me in." That was the last night Marcus stayed in that apartment. He moved out within the week, but sometimes, in the dead of night, he still hears the whisper. Marcus, I'm with you.
Story number 7.
It started with a package on her doorstep. Lila lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing exciting ever happened. She enjoyed the predictability of her routine: work, gym, dinner, and an hour of TV before bed. So, when she found an unmarked brown box on her porch one evening, it piqued her curiosity. There was no return address, no label, just her name written in uneven black ink. She hesitated for a moment, but then brought it inside. The box was surprisingly light. Inside, she found a single Polaroid photograph. It was of her living room, taken from the perspective of her kitchen. Lila froze. The angle was unmistakable. Someone had been inside her house. Her immediate thought was to call the police, but there were no signs of a break-in. Every door and window was still locked, and nothing seemed out of place. She convinced herself it was a prank, maybe a cruel joke from one of her coworkers. But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The next morning, another package arrived. This one contained a Polaroid of her bedroom, taken from the foot of her bed while she was asleep. Panic set in. Lila searched her entire house, checking every closet, under every piece of furniture. Nothing. She even installed new locks and a security camera at her front door. The following night, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was from the security app linked to her camera. A motion alert. She opened the app, her hands trembling. The footage showed a figure in a dark hoodie standing on her porch, staring directly into the camera. The figure held up a Polaroid camera, took a photo, and placed it on the doormat before disappearing into the darkness. Lila didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she found the photo on her doorstep. This time, it was a picture of her bathroom mirror. Written on the mirror in lipstick were the words, "I see you." She decided she couldn't stay in the house any longer. She packed a bag and drove to her sister's place, vowing not to return until she figured out what was going on. That night, her sister's house was quiet. Lila finally felt like she could relax, surrounded by family. She locked the guest bedroom door, placed her phone on the nightstand, and tried to sleep. At 3:14 a.m., her phone buzzed with another notification. Her breath caught as she unlocked the screen. It was a photo. It showed her lying in her sister's guest bed, taken from the corner of the room, and below it a message, "You can't run."
Story number 8.
It was a dare she couldn't resist. Mia's friends loved to test her nerves, always trying to see how far she'd go to prove she wasn't scared of anything. This time, they dared her to spend the night in the old Grayson house, a decrepit, abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. The Grayson house had a reputation. Locals whispered about the family that had lived there decades ago, claiming they all vanished overnight, leaving behind a dinner table set for 5 and an eerie silence that no one could explain. The house had remained untouched ever since, its windows boarded up, its doors creaking with age. Armed with a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and her phone for proof, Mia arrived at the house just after sunset. Her friends waited outside in their cars, promising to check on her at sunrise. "Don't chicken out," one of them teased as she stepped onto the crumbling porch. The inside of the house smelled of damp wood and decay. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. She set up her sleeping bag in what used to be the living room, the remnants of old furniture casting long, jagged shadows in her flashlight's beam. The first few hours were uneventful. She texted her friends, took a few selfies, and explored the house. Most of the rooms were empty, their walls peeling with age. But the dining room still had the table set for dinner, the plates and cutlery coated in decades of dust. It wasn't until midnight that things started to feel off. Mia was lying in her sleeping bag, scrolling through her phone when she heard it. the faint sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. Her breath caught. She held still, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and heavy, as if someone were pacing back and forth. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. Mia sat up, her flashlight sweeping across the room. Nothing. She told herself it was probably an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a stray cat. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. An hour later, the sound returned. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. She heard whispering. It was faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakably human. The words were jumbled, overlapping, like several voices speaking at once. Mia's pulse quickened. She gathered her things and deciding she'd had enough. But as she reached the front door, she realized something horrifying. It wouldn't open. The doorknob wouldn't turn, and the boards on the windows seemed to press tighter against the glass, as if the house itself were alive. "Let me out," she yelled, pounding on the door. The whispering grew louder, coming from all around her now. She spun in circles, the beam of her flashlight darting across the room. Shadows danced on the walls, shapes that didn't belong to her, or the furniture. Suddenly, a deafening crash came from the dining room. Mia ran toward the noise, her heart in her throat. The dining table had been overturned, the dusty plates shattered on the floor, and in the middle of the chaos, carved into the wooden table, were the words, "You shouldn't have come." Mia backed away, tears streaming down her face. She turned and sprinted up the staircase, desperate to find another way out. At the top of the stairs, she froze. Standing at the end of the hallway was a figure. It was tall and featureless, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Slowly, it began to move toward her, its footsteps echoing in the suffocating silence. Mia stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering. She turned and ran into one of the upstairs rooms, slamming the door shut behind her. The whispering was deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Mia's phone buzzed in her pocket. With shaking hands, she pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from her own number. "You can't leave." The bedroom door creaked open behind her. Mia's scream was swallowed by the darkness.
Story number 9.
It was just supposed to be a quiet weekend in the cabin. Lena had been looking forward to the getaway for weeks. She needed a break from her stressful job and busy city life. The cabin was located deep in the woods, far from civilization, which made it the perfect spot to unwind. No distractions, no interruptions. When she arrived, the place seemed perfect. The air was fresh, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird chirping. She unpacked, made a cup of tea, and sat by the large window, watching the sun dip behind the trees. As night fell, she lit the fireplace and settled in for a cozy evening. But just after midnight, she heard something. A soft thump against the window. She froze, her teacup midair. The sound came again. Another thump, this time louder, followed by a faint scratching noise. It sounded like something or someone was trying to get in. Lena's heart raced. She told herself it was just an animal, a raccoon or a bird maybe. But then the scratching grew more frantic, louder, as if something was dragging its nails across the glass. She stood up, her legs shaky, and went to the window. Nothing. Just the dark woods, stretching endlessly into the night. She exhaled in relief, blaming her overactive imagination. Maybe the wind had caused the noise. But when she turned away from the window, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The shadow of a person, tall and thin, standing just outside the cabin door. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, her hand shaking as she reached for her phone. She didn't want to go outside to confront whatever it was, but she needed to know who or what was standing out there. She crept toward the door, peeking through the small peephole. The figure was still there, unmoving, just standing on the porch in the dark. And then it did something that made Lena's stomach drop. It slowly raised its hand and pressed its palm flat against the glass of the door. The fingers stretched impossibly long, the skin pale and unnatural in the dim light. Terrified, Lena backed away and locked the door. She grabbed her phone to call for help, but the signal was weak, barely a bar. She tried again, and just as the call began to go through, a loud banging echoed against the door. "Bang! Bang! Bang!" Lena screamed, running to the back of the cabin. The banging grew louder, more violent, as if something was trying to break in. She rushed to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, her hands trembling as she held it in front of her for protection. Then, there was silence. She waited, not daring to move. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Finally, she crept back to the front door, her fingers trembling on the handle. She slowly opened it, peering outside into the darkness. Nothing. The porch was empty. The figure was gone. She stepped outside cautiously, scanning the woods around her, but there was no sign of anyone or anything, just the eerie stillness of the night. But as she turned to go back inside, she noticed something on the doorstep, a small, neatly folded piece of paper. With a trembling hand, Lena unfolded it. It read, "You didn't look close enough." Her blood ran cold. The figure hadn't just been outside the door. It had been inside, standing behind her the whole time. Lena didn't stay in the cabin another minute. She grabbed her things and fled into the woods, not stopping until she reached the nearest town. To this day, she refuses to go near the cabin again. The woods are too quiet, too still. And when the night is clear and dark, she can still hear the soft scratching noise against her window.
Story number 10.
Late one autumn evening, the warm glow of a lone porch light flickered against the encroaching darkness. Mia had just settled in for a quiet night at her rural home, tucked miles away from the nearest neighbor. The isolation didn't bother her. Normally, she found solace in the quiet. But tonight, the air carried an unfamiliar weight, as though the woods surrounding her home were holding their breath. She had her usual routine: lock the doors, pull the curtains, and double-check the windows. Each click of the locks was a small comfort, a reminder that she was secure. The evening stretched lazily as she curled up on the couch, the muffled sound of a true crime documentary filling the silence. At first, it was just a creak. Houses settle, she reminded herself. But then came another, this time louder, as though someone or something was testing the weight of the floorboards. Mia froze, her hand gripping the blanket tightly. She muted the TV, her pulse quickening as she strained her ears. Nothing. Convincing herself it was her imagination, she exhaled slowly and turned the sound back on. Moments later, her phone buzzed on the coffee table, startling her. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why don't you answer the door?" Her heart stopped. She glanced at the front door, her mind racing. There had been no knock, no sound at all. Trembling, she typed back, "Who is this?" A reply came almost immediately. "I'm already inside." Mia's blood ran cold. She bolted upright, clutching her phone. The logical part of her brain insisted it was a cruel prank, but her instincts screamed otherwise. She darted toward the kitchen to grab a knife, her footsteps silent against the hardwood floor. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. She was plunged into darkness, her own breath now her only companion. Panic clawed at her chest as she crouched behind the kitchen island, phone in hand. The screen lit up with another message. "Hide and seek? You're not very good at this." Mia stifled a scream, her trembling fingers dialing 911. The call connected, but before she could speak, a voice, a low, rasping whisper, spoke on the line. "They can't help you." She dropped the phone in terror, its screen shattering against the tile. Tears streamed down her face as she realized the voice hadn't come from the phone. It had come from behind her. Slowly, Mia turned her head. A shadow loomed in the darkness, too tall, too still. Its eyes glinted faintly, catching the sliver of moonlight that seeped through the curtains. Her scream was swallowed by the night. The next morning, the house stood silent. The police found the front door ajar and no sign of Mia, save for a shattered phone and a single message scrawled on the wall in crimson. "Found you."